everyone, and welcome back to the Infodump, the series where I do a deep but not necessarily scholarly dive into a particular topic. We are continuing with our first topic of physics, specifically with the same subtopic as last week, which is motion. So last week I touched on sort of the broad strokes of what moving means and how it works, particularly in a four-dimensional world. A bit of a disclaimer, I am once again inexplicably tired. I do not know why. I just know that I require sleep. And it doesn't seem like I'm going to be getting it in the next half hour, because I've got this to record, and then edit, and then upload. Oh god. Anyway, if I seem super just out of it, that is why. I need to start recording these during the day instead of in the middle of the night, but during the day there's other people moving around and such, which creates background noise, which I don't want to have to meticulously go through and cut out. So yeah, you're gonna have to deal with me being super tired, at least for this one. With that out of the way, yes, so motion, as touched on last time, is just a change in position both in space and in time. Now, when we talk about things moving, we always couch that in the context of them having kinetic energy. Now, one of the slightly wonky effects of relativity is that the faster something is moving, the more mass it has. This also means that it requires exponentially more, well, kinetic energy to get something moving faster once you get up to near light speed. Granted, we are never at near light speed, except if we are trying to send people very far very fast, in which case it's kind of counterproductive. That is part of why the speed of light is used as the sort of universal speed limit. Although there are plenty of ways to sort of cheat it, like wormholes, or manipulating space-time around you to create a sort of bubble effect where the laws of physics don't quite apply the same way. There's all sorts of theoretical ways we can cheat it, but so far none of those have actually been put into any semblance of functional practice. And for as long as light remains our universal speed limit and remains our sort of one true constant in terms of velocity, well, that's sort of what we have to couch everything in the context of. See, light, for some reason, moves at the exact same speed regardless of your frame of reference. That is something that is only possible through the compression and expansion of space and time, which is part of how we managed to figure out that that is something that actually happens. And it is fundamental to our current way of measuring things. See, despite what anyone in any science class might have you believe, we actually define the meter based on the speed of light. So, 1 meter is the distance that light travels in roughly 1/3 millionth of a second. We define time based on the oscillation of certain, very specific isotopes of quartz and a couple other really, really esoteric things. But really what it comes down to is our main system of measurement for everything is that universal constant of how fast light goes in a second. This helps because everything except the speed of light and a few other fundamental constants of the universe is frustratingly vague and variable. For instance, weight. Weight is connected to mass, which, except for relativistic velocity, doesn't change, but relativistic velocity does change it, so it's not even that reliable then. But something's weight depends on what planet you're on, or what part of the planet you're on. If you're at the equator, you're actually technically farther away from the center of the Earth than you would be at the poles. There have been all sorts of cases of this creating problems for people who work in weight. For instance, prospectors who went up to the Yukon for gold back in the 1800s then came back to the continental US and learned that the gold that they had was not worth as much because it did not weigh as much, because they were slightly further away from the center of the Earth and therefore from its gravitational pull. This is the sort of thing that might not seem like it has big effects because the actual numbers involved are pretty small, but ultimately it does. So just keep in mind going forward that all of the numbers and the metrics and the frameworks we are using are in some way specifically tied to fundamental universal constants. Usually they are derived several times from that. So, for instance, the meter is a pretty simple and straightforward example, right? That's just derived from the speed of light, or it is now anyway. Whereas the kilogram, there is an actual physical thing that is officially the mass of a kilogram, and its mass is 1 kilogram. Period. This is a very stupid decision, because we could just as easily have said, okay, we'll have 1 kilogram be, this amount of meters on a side cube of pure material with a known density that is fixed. Except actually no, because thermal expansion is an issue there. So, yeah, you'd have to have it be at a very specific amount of thermal energy as well, and then, yeah. Mass is a really tricky thing to measure because it does change with velocity, but also because all of our other attempts at measuring it would run into things that can change its dimensions and therefore its density. So, yeah. Anyway, this episode is supposed to be about motion, so let's actually start talking about motion. Sorry, I do have to apologize for, like I said, I am super tired, so I'm super scatterbrained, super just out of it, and I just want to get this over with and go to bed, so I'm not going to be polishing this really at all. It's a bit of a turd anyway, and you can polish a turd. The Mythbusters proved that, but it doesn't mean it's gonna be great. Anyway, when we talk about motion, there are two key equations that we deal with. I talked about one of them last time. That is kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So when you have something moving fast, it's got exponentially more kinetic energy than something that is moving slower. Unless there's a huge difference in the mass, but we're assuming the same object moving at 2 different speeds. Now the other one is force equals mass times acceleration. And if you know your calculus, which, who knows, maybe you do, maybe you don't, force equals mass times acceleration you would be able to recognize as the derivative, which is to say the measure of change, for kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. That is part of how we know those two equations are correct, is because they have the mathematical relationship that we know describes a measure of a thing and the measure of its change over time. So, with force, this is really where talking about the fundamental forces kind of starts to break down, because they aren't really forces. A force in physics is something that creates that, change in kinetic energy. And while it's certainly true that the fundamental forces can create changes in kinetic energy, I mean, just look at gravity, they're also not really forces in that sense. Because there's more to them than that, right? Gravity is the curvature of space-time, which, yes, results in a change in velocity, really a change in acceleration that causes a change in velocity. But it's the curve in space-time, and when you straighten it all out and look at space-time as a whole, there is no change there. Which is frustrating, because if they're not forces, then what are they? Well, that's why there's a whole host of other terms that have sprung up to try and encapsulate them. But the one that I personally prefer is the four fundamental fields. You have a strong, weak, electromagnetic, and gravitational, and all of those are fields. Of course, that now leaves us with that more classical definition of a force, where you have a thing acting on another thing to impart a change in kinetic energy. And, of course, we can try and measure that in multiple different ways, but the most common one is just by saying, okay, what is the change in velocity, the acceleration, and what is the mass of the object? Now, when you don't necessarily have access to that, you have to go by a whole bunch of other metrics, but you can get to the eventual same conclusion. This is really the core of what most physics of motion boils down to, is how much force is being applied here, how is it changing the kinetic energy, and most importantly, what is its direction relative to the existing direction. Because when you're talking about it just purely in terms of numbers, you will usually see it boiled down to either positive or negative. Right? Something has either a positive velocity or a negative velocity, and there's either a positive force, which means it's reinforcing the positive velocity, or a negative force, which means it's reinforcing a negative velocity or reducing a positive velocity. But of course, we live in a four-dimensional world that we just give the middle finger to the fourth dimension of, but we still care about those three dimensions of space. And that is where vectors come in. Usually, we measure velocity as a vector. That is to say, we take its velocity, we take an object's velocity in one direction, and then an object's velocity in another dimension, and then the object's velocity in the third dimension. And we compile those together to get its velocity vector. So you can have an object with a velocity of positive 16 in x, positive 2 in y, and negative 3 in z. And then you'll have your velocity vector going from the 0 point to a point on a three-dimensional graph that has the coordinates of x equals 16, y equals 3, and z equals negative 2. I think those are the numbers I said anyway. Likewise, we can also have force vectors, and that is usually how they manifest. For instance, if you think of putting a bowling ball on a hill, yeah, it'll roll down. But the sort of pseudo-force from gravity is only pulling it downwards. So if you think about it like that, and try and divorce yourself from the conventional wisdom that you already have from life experience, it doesn't make sense that a force pulling it only downwards would be able to make it move sideways as well. That is where the deflection comes in from what we call the normal force. That is the force that resists motion. Or more accurately, the force that is equal and opposite to another force. This doesn't come from the object being moved, but rather from anything you try to move it into. This is the force that causes things to bounce off of each other. The force that causes, like I said, the bowling ball to move along the hill rather than just not being able to go down the incline at all. A normal force is always perpendicular, which is to say, at a 90-degree angle to the surface that is, quote-unquote, creating it. So when we take the acceleration vector from the normal force on that bowling ball, and the acceleration vector from the gravitational force, the gravitational force is all going straight down. But the normal force, while of an equal magnitude, is at an angle, meaning that some of the force causes the ball to move sideways along the incline, whereas the rest is doing as gravity intended and pulling it downwards. So by having those different vectors, we create a more complicated and more realistic model of how forces and motion actually work. Now, that is all just a representation, and a very symbolic one at that. No matter how hard we try and boil things down and make them make sense, the universe does not like being constrained like that. In physics, you often have to deal with Brownian motion or other forms of random motion that don't necessarily follow any sort of pattern, and they are the result of entropy, of heat. This is, generally speaking, not a bad thing. It's just a frustrating one. Which, I mean, hey, who can blame the universe for wanting to make life a little bit unpredictable and interesting, right? Anyway, all that said, I know it's very much early. This has been a very short episode, but like I said at the start, I'm tired as hell. I need to go the fuck to sleep. I'm having trouble keeping my eyes open. I'm having trouble coming up with coherent sentences to say. So I'm going to let you all go now. Thank you very much for watching and or listening, and I will see you next time.